leaking top insider stock trades every day until they stop us. We're looking at the week of September 15th to the 19th. Remember, there's like 1,000 insider trades that came in over the week. Almost all of them are totally useless. We need to look through those to find the highly unusual ones that could give us high signal and help us outperform. Taking a look at the insider trades for the week, we'll look at the weekly data here. We can see it's going to be a pretty typical week. We're a little under, in terms of the percent of insiders that are buying versus selling, we're a little below the median, but it's nothing too crazy. It's kind of where we've been for the last few weeks. And again, we pretty much only care so much if it's super low, then that'd be notable. Or even more importantly is when we see these huge spikes up here, that's when you really want to pay attention, when there's tons more insiders buying than selling, especially if you see big spikes around earnings season, because during earnings season, the month that earnings are happening, insiders can't really buy or make discretionary trades, but they can keep their 10b5-1 plans going. So their 10b5-1 sales will continue, but then the buys will dwindle down. So that just kind of naturally will bring this bar below the median. But if you see, like in April this year with all the tariff stuff, insiders were buying a ton. Almost half of all insider trades were buys, and that was during an earnings month. So that's a huge, huge increase. That's really what we're looking for. This week's relatively low insider purchasing is nothing too crazy to worry about. We did have Elon Musk's purchase, which is why there's such a big bar here. I mean, he literally 90% of the insider buying this week was just Elon Musk's purchase. And then another large portion of it was a bunch of IPO purchases, which also not super interesting. So I don't think there's really much to look at in terms of much interesting in terms of how little or lot of insider selling or buying there was. Pretty normal week. So let's go take a look here at this last week. We'll start with the buys here. So as you can see, yeah, Tesla's Elon Musk's purchase up here, and then there's a bunch of IPO purchases that we can see up here as well. So the biggest purchase outside of those was CG Oncology here, which a $50 million purchase is always interesting, especially when you start to talk about some of those therapeutics or biotech companies, any of the companies that might have some sort of earnings or trial readout or phase update or clinical update or anything like that. Obviously, the stock will tend to pop or drop a lot based on those. So this was a stock that I actually own a little bit of because of this insider purchase. So it's up a little bit since then, though I believe it actually got hit today. Let's see. So down. So yeah, it's probably flat once this price updates so far. But just, I mean, a $50 million purchase in a biotech company essentially, is very interesting to me. And you can see just from the news flow here, some positive news flow coming out in terms of them completing enrollment in a trial. They had good results coming out of their Bond 003 cohort, which these were a couple weeks ago, which is what led to this increase here. But some of this positive result here seems like it might lend itself to some positive momentum in the stock itself. And just again, when you've got, I don't think there's any, at least as far as I could tell, I don't believe there were any upcoming trial results coming soon. I guess we could just see if Google Finance has any info for us. But I mean, if you see insider buying, it might just tilt you a little bit toward those readouts being a little better. They have a very active clinical trial program. Here's a summary. On September 5th, they updated some good updates. Showed a robust 24-month complete response rate. 90% had some enrollment completion. They gave her a presentation. So they plan to initiate a license in the fourth quarter of this year in April. Updates from this trial, and it updates. Yeah, so they initiated some trial here. Maybe some updates could be coming up, future readouts. So it doesn't look like anything coming super, super soon. But sometimes with these kind of companies, when you start to get some of that positive momentum going into trial readouts, you see this insider buying, we see some positive updates going on before. Always going to be risky, but that momentum can kind of sustain itself because again, there's no real reason for the stock to move until there is more readouts. And so now you just kind of have the technical structural factors of the stock price going up will start to show up on more screens. You have the positive news, you have the insider buying, all that kind of stuff could lend itself to the stock just kind of working its way up until we get closer to some trial readouts. And then as we get closer to some of that stuff, hopefully we see more insider buying. Or if we see some insider selling, it might be time to sell off and move on to the next thing. Another pharmaceutical company, this time it's a 10% owner, which I find a little less interesting. Also, this company looks brand new, so not really much info there. This one, so when you see the shares here, it looks like this guy must have been buying and selling at the same time, which normally they're doing it because they're moving it. Yeah, it looks like they're just moving it to probably moving it to an a different account essentially. So not very interesting here. Now we've got another big purchase here at Alpha Metallurgical Resources, which I think this is another one that's fairly interesting. Take a look at the news here. Nothing really noticeable coming out about the news. If we look, we can get a little bit better or a little more news if we go to Koifin. We can just take a look at, I already forget which stock we're looking at. So it looks like, so you can see it recently broke a very long downtrend here and is now momentum is starting to go in the right direction. So that's a positive. In terms of any news, the only news is just the insider buying shares, which again at $16 million is a pretty massive purchase. If we look just to see if there's any other press releases, any other filings, no press releases, which we already would have seen on before. Insider buying, no news. Any filings? It's like there was a recent filing. Was it anything useful? An indirect subsidy received an imminent danger order. I mean, sounds bad, but not super related. Some specialized disclosure. So it doesn't seem like there's really all that much going on here. No, yeah, they had earnings calls, obviously. But in terms of news flow, there's not really anything to notice. I do think it is notable that the momentum's heading in the right direction, which just from like a technical standpoint would be positive for the stock. There is a little bit of selling here, but just a pretty relatively small $330,000 sale versus this director making a massive $16 million sale, which we can now just go look historically to see what their previous trades look like, and they nailed their sale timing. So it looks like they've only ever sold the stock, kind of nailed it up here at the top, another sale on the way down, all unscheduled. It does look like they bought Innovate, which they must have just also been a director at Innovate way back when. They somehow timed it pretty poorly. They missed the COVID dip, bought after the COVID dip, and I mean, I guess the stock went up a little bit afterwards, but I wouldn't say the greatest timing of all time there. But just looking at Alpha Metallurgical Resources here, we see very well-timed sales, now flipping to a buy. So it's interesting on multiple fronts. One, largest trade ever, 16 million, 60% larger than the next biggest one. They're flipping from 2, 4, 6, 7 sales in a row to a purchase. Always notable when they flip like that. And then obviously increasing their holdings by almost 20% is interesting. The stock kind of starting to curl up and trend in the right direction if you're into the technical side of things is pretty interesting. Overall, a very interesting purchase, that one. Saba Capital, continuing, you're going to see them a bunch of times. Oh, they just continue to buy gold, continue to buy gold, continue to buy gold, which is another one that I had also own a couple gold stocks based on some of this insider selling. And obviously it's just kind of, gold is a nice one to have on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum of any of like the tech and any of those other stocks that have been running really heavy, running really high momentum and just performing very well, which gold has been too, but they're kind of on different ends of the economy in terms of how they perform based on how the economy is going. So always fun to have a little diversity there. Looking through what else we have, NextDecade is another very interesting one where we can just take a quick look. We can see here, so it's a liquefied natural gas company. They greenlit their train 4, meaning a big new facility, and the stock tanked. The reason the stock tanked, we can go see here. We look at next. Let's look at the summary. So you can see the big tank down there, which obviously, you normally don't like to buy. Normally, if you like stocks that are trending in the right direction, but insider buying can be a pretty good dip, little reversal, whatever you want to call it, signal, I guess. We look at, I don't actually think that's going to tell us. So if we look at the news here, we'll be able to see, well, we got the insider buys that we just noticed, which a handful of insiders buying the stock, but we've got a couple of downgrades here. We've got TD Cowen downgrading to a hold from a buy. We have Morgan Stanley double downgrading from overweight to equal weight with a big 50% price target cut. So both of them downgraded the stock as well. And it basically came down to, if you want to, you can go ask. One nice thing about Google Finance for now, at least, you could ask them why the analyst downgraded, and sometimes they'll be able to give you the answer, because most of the time these analysts, they can't actually tell you why here. They just give you the headline. But the gist is that the reason they downgraded them was because once this funding announcement came out and they, greenlit going forward with the Train 4, the analysts believe that the projections are on the lower end. The guidance is on the lower end of what they expected, and they believe that the executive team is being a little too bullish with some of their numbers and assumptions. So you basically just have a disagreement between the two. And why I think this is interesting from a structure, just like a structural standpoint, I don't know much about this industry, not what I typically play in, but I think solely looking at it from ignoring the actual company itself and just looking at it from pricing, essentially, and like the news, you have essentially the analysts downgrading the stock up here in the $10 range. Stock's all the way down to $6. So even even with who was it, Morgan Stanley or whoever it was, that gave them the price target of $5, we've made we're 80% of the way there basically, or 70% of the way there. But now you've got insiders buying. So you've got the two competing stories, which is analysts saying, hey, these numbers aren't going to be as good as we think. Then you have the insiders that seem to disagree. Buying $8 million of the stock, $8.9 million stock for insiders buying is certainly nothing to sneeze at. And they bought through a handful of days, and it looks like some more buys literally just came in. So all of that together now has a pretty interesting setup where it seems like the market really discounted and really believed the analyst reports that came out. But now you have the insiders saying the opposite, and the market hasn't really reacted to that. So I think when you have these two opposing viewpoints, the insiders versus the analysts, and the stock price has very heavily favored what the analysts are saying, it sets up a pretty interesting just structural situation, just thinking about it from like the statistics probability side of things, where you now have a market priced much more for the analysts. But to me, at least, I think the insider buying is certainly something of a signal, and I would probably expect it to be weighted not so heavily in the analyst favor here. So because of that, I just think it's like an interesting structural setup with a huge dip, the market believing what the analysts say, and then the execs coming in and being like, hey, I kind of disagree. I think we're going to be all right. And it just sets up an interesting little play there. Moving on, Ryan Specialty Holdings, we've got the executive here, the executive chairman taking a huge purchase, which let's see what this looks like historically. I think this is a pretty notable purchase. If we look historically at his timing, not the greatest, but these are tiny. I don't really know why he was just buying like $5,000 doesn't make any sense. These are his big purchases back here, which he timed quite well. Obviously, he was buying during a dip at the end of 2022. He bought another dip there in 2023, and now we're dipping again, down 20% in the last 3 months, and he's buying the stock again. If we look at the news here, looks like nothing too crazy that we could mention there. They do, if you go read their reports, which let's just see if they tell us anything in the press release side of things at least. So real quick, we can look at the size. $14 million, so largest purchase ever. First purchase since all the way back in 2023, I think is notable, or first non-tiny $5,000 purchase. Since then, I don't know if anybody else is buying. Let's see. So it doesn't look like there's really been any other trading for the last few months. We had a couple of small sales back here, which you always would prefer to only see buys, but the stock is down another, 15 over 60, 7, 8, 10%, whatever that number is, since then. So 20%, I guess, in the last 3 months. Some terrible mental math there, but the stock's way down since they sold basically. Now you've got an executive buying the dip. Maybe we start to see this flatten out and come up here, which would be interesting. If you really wanted to wait, you could wait for positive momentum signal. Like the research just kind of says, I just kind of like using the 200-day if you want to use any sort of momentum number here. But you could kind of wait. This at some point, this is going to keep coming down, and maybe in the next month or two or something, you might see them cross. In the next couple of months, you might see them cross somewhere around 55 or 60. If they're behaving as you'd like, and you could get in there once the technicals kind of confirm it, or you can try to join in with the CEO and start buying early. We delivered solid second quarter, highlighting the resiliency of our platform, further expanded margins. So they do acknowledge we are very proud of our team's execution, particularly when considering the challenging property pricing environment. Although solid results, we success along with our solid results, blah, 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 blah. So they do acknowledge basically that they've been in a pretty tough environment, which is kind of the whole reason their stock's getting smacked here. But it is interesting to see the acknowledgement of the environment, but then also, maybe it looks like they also did mention, if you were to read the call, they mentioned they don't actually see the market improving a ton in the second half of 2025, or at least they didn't during that earnings call. But obviously at some point it's going to bottom out and expectations will start to go up a little bit. Could be interesting that it looks like maybe the exec chairman's trying to call the bottom here of like, okay, yes, we've had a rough few months. We know the next couple months are going to be rough, but we believe we are closer to the end than the beginning of this kind of downturn, and things might turn around. So I think that's an interesting signal there and something worth looking into for sure. We can see if any of the ones have gone up quite a bit since we started. So Oblong, this was one we called out quite a few times. This was a stock I've actually owned for a while because of just as part of a crypto treasury play. It's a total garbage company, but those total garbage companies can be the ones where they have the highest signal insider buying. Like you can see no insider buying before, but now all of a sudden we have some insider buying. They also issued this shareholder letter that was very promotional, them basically talking about how they're, crypto treasury, but the Tau token and how it's going to change everything and blah, blah, blah. So I have a bet of just some of these crypto treasury companies companies just because I think it's kind of a fun play. But I wouldn't be surprised if we don't continue to see them try to just pump their stock, because what else do you do with a crypto treasury stock? There's not much else to do except to pump it. So CG Oncology, as we mentioned already. Synopsys was another good one that we shared in a video and in the emails and everything, because I'm sure if you pay any attention to the tech space, you know what went on there, which was the massive earnings dip, their worst earnings of all time. Investors trying to get money back, which is not quite how investing goes. The first ever purchase, it looks like, by this director that we saw, if I remember correctly. Yeah, first ever purchase after tons of selling, a lot of 10b5-1 sales, but then a handful of unscheduled sales as well. Not at this company, all at Trimble, it looks like, whereas returns didn't necessarily seem to be the best, whereas the CEO there. But you can see him deciding to buy some, 20% of his holdings, a pretty sizable amount, relatively speaking, for a director, 150K. Buying after the stock dipped is always notable. And we also had, if you'll remember, there's quite a few write-ups, so you could pretty easily get up to speed on why the stock died if you just went to joinyellowbrick.com, typed in the ticker Synopsys, and you could see crashed 36% on due to weak guidance, but the long-term thesis still intact, at least according to these people. You should probably read some of these people's other pitches, or at least look at their returns to have an idea of whether or not they should be listened to. But we have a few, like I know this guy's really good too. Small position taken despite Q4 issues and management credibility hit. But again, it's similar. They like near term, maybe not much positive, but long-term outlook is positive as well. So this seems like a long-term play, people buying the dip, and then you've got the executives also joining in to buy the dip, or the director at least. I think all of that makes for a notable setup. So yeah, and the stock's already up 15%, but obviously being up 15% after being down 30% means you are still nowhere near being fully recovered, which they did actually, their guidance took a big hit. So it makes sense the stock was down, but you like to see a little bit of confidence from the insiders there, plus some bullish write-ups on Yellowbrick. All makes it interesting, which you can go to, it's just joinyellowbrick.com, you can type in a ticker and see, nobody was talking about Oblong, but for most popular stocks, you can find at least somebody writing it up, and even for a lot of non-popular ones, you can as well. Another insider, as you can see, some of the insiders that were good at Energy Vault Holdings, at CSPI, their stocks obviously are up, so always nice to see. Let's now go take a look. Here's actually an interesting one, which I don't think we're testing a new version of CEOWatcher.com, which is going to be much nicer, that we will, and it'll update much quicker, but you'll notice, big back and forth, the CEO here actually just made a huge sale, which came through in my kind of real-time updates, but not updated on here. So interesting to see big buys and big sales, though once the sale comes through, it's quite a bit bigger. It was a $2 million sale, so it's going to be bigger than all of these. But interesting to see, again, the therapeutic pharma companies are always such like a battleground, always such a volatile stock, which does make them very hard to play, but if you can get the proper signals, you can make a ton of money pretty quickly, or lose it also. It's always interesting to see when you have insiders buying or selling, especially with the catalyst coming up, which I didn't look into that one. I don't know if there's catalyst coming up or not, but it's interesting to see relatively sizable buying and selling on the same side of things. So now we will go looking at the sales here. So Vlad had to make a $400 million tax sale, which is a very rich person problem to have. Bunch of 10% owners, which, you know what, I don't even care about the 10% owners. We're gonna nuke all those, and that'll kind of knock us down some. So Rocket Lab, an impossibly hard company because of the how much momentum and how, let's see it's been actually pretty flat over the last week or so. I guess a couple months it's been flat. So yeah, it did actually fall down below the momentum line, but it's up a ton, 3 to 50. It is up an astounding amount in just the last year and a half or so. So very, very hard to try to time when those stocks are gonna turn around, but almost certainly this stock is it's up 550% in the last year, 900% in the last 2 years. Like, it's gonna have to give some of it back at some time. So this is one of those ones, and these are huge sales. We've got the CEO here making a $120+ million sale, $127 million sale. It is part of a 10b5-1 plan, but it appears this is his first sale on it, so he just turned it on, and we'll see if he continues to sell or not. But it's a sizable, it's a real big sale, $120 million. And then on top of that, you've got another director now making an unscheduled sale for $90 million. So $225 million in sales, which I would guess is going to be the most selling. There was $100 million sales in Q4 of 2024, which the stock did go down some, about 20.5% or so, 20% after those. So by far the biggest selling, and with the 10b5-1, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't continue to see the insiders selling even more of the stock. Going forward, NVIDIA, Jensen's been selling, part of a 10b5-1 plan for a while. A lot of other executives also selling, actually, which we can see all sorts of selling, which we are starting starting to see, I mean, just kind of starting to look across some of the semi and AI plays. A lot of the meme stocks are obviously still just going bonkers, but some of the bigger companies that were driving the entire NASDAQ and S&P up, or especially a lot of the bigger like AI and semiconductor plays, which I guess were also the things driving, NASDAQ and S&P up, are really starting to flatten out a little bit, which I do think is kind of interesting. Let's see what other sales we want to take a look at. EchoStar, they sold off some stuff. Stock went way up, so insiders taking some profit there. The Interactive Brokers is kind of interesting because this would be an interesting stock to pay attention to because we got the chief financial officer here just selling a bunch of the stock. And this is another one where I'm pretty sure the real-time platform, I just saw another sale from that guy come in now. So bunch of selling. Stock up 200% in the last 2 years, 100% in the last year, starting to flatten out, starting to get a bunch of selling here. Let's take a look what we have. So again, yeah, recently crossed under this, so we'll see going forward under the 200-day SMA. We'll see what happens if it gets back up and starts to bounce off of it and what's going on. But I mean, there's a good reason the stock's up. You can see the earnings consensus estimates just have been rising and the stock's been going up with them. But any of these brokerage stocks, Robinhood, Interactive Brokers, those kind of things, if the economy turns around at any point and consumers don't have tons of money to just spend on gambling and investing in all kinds of stuff, those are obviously going to get crushed. So it's worth just taking a note of like, hey, what are some of these companies where we're seeing some pretty big insider buying or insider selling? If they start to turn over and you're somebody that likes to either sell or go short some of these stocks, then might be the time to take a look at them. But right now you just be selling into a pretty frothy market still, which is always tough to do. Moving on, lots and lots of 10b5-1 sales, continued selling at Vistra, which we've seen kind of up all through the increase here. The CEO there at Hims also continues to sell the stock, which, as we've discussed quite a few times, Hims has been struggling in terms of just like a lot of negative news coming out. You got the insider selling. They broke down below the 200-day is still moving upwards, obviously, but they did break down below it. Will be interesting to see how they, if what kind of happens here. A very popular stock that's now though been flat for the year. And, it's been flat for the year, and just most of the, at least short-term news and stuff that's come out has not been very friendly to Hims, which let's see. The FDA warning them over misleading claims, getting investigated. It's a kind of a tough go for them. What else do we have here? We've got the insiders at Loan Depot, stock pop. Insiders are all like, thank you, I'm going to sell all of this increase. That's another one that's kind of worth paying attention to. Again, if this thing starts to turn over, I mean, just so many insiders taking advantage of dumping tons of the stock after that increase would be worth paying attention to. Here's the last one we'll probably end on, and this is a pretty interesting one to me because we see, and this is kind of one of those ones where you're trying to develop a story for why somebody might be doing what they're doing. And this one lines up pretty good because you can see the CEO filed a $5 million sale, which pretty small, relatively speaking. However, if we look historically, he has timed his sales. I don't even need to go back that far. This one, he timed long-term. This one wasn't timed very well, but over the next 3 months, it was down 8%, and then it was about flat over the next 6 months, so not the best timing. This one, he obviously nailed the timing on up here, but this one's interesting because, so he has got iffy to decent returns on previous sales. It's the CEO, it's a large sale, it's unscheduled, tracks all those boxes, but it was filed on 9/15. They also scheduled their conference call to discuss their third quarter earnings results on 9/15 at the same time, which their earnings call is going to be before the market opens on Thursday, October 23rd, which will be, their earnings are actually going to be released on Wednesday the 22nd, which means that their quarter ending at the end of this month, September. So he is selling, a pretty sizable chunk of the stock just 2 weeks before the quarter closes, which means he definitely knows how the company is going. I just thought it was kind of a funny signal that the same day they're announcing, hey, we're going to share earnings, the CEO is like, yeah, I'm selling some stock here. So that would be, I think, to me, that would be the whole play here is just like, okay, CEO selling before earnings. You could even go back, you could even go see what happened, like how close were these two to those earnings calls as well, and then what happened on those earnings calls. And if both those earnings calls went poorly, I think that even make this a stronger story about like, hey, I think there's a decent chance that these earnings calls don't come in, particularly good, because why would the CEO be selling $5 million when the quarter is 90% done? So he basically knows what the numbers are going to be. You know, if he wanted to sell $5 million, he could just wait 6 weeks and sell after the stock goes up if the earnings were going to be good. Could be hinting at, you know, some poor earnings or at least not great earnings coming out. So that is an interesting one there. You can go to CEOwatcher.com to find all the insider trades, do all your own sorting, filtering, you know, just finding insiders with top returns, looking what they're buying, etc. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you later.